The runway shimmered in the midday sun, the heat waves rising like ghostly apparitions over the tarmac. Passengers aboard Flight 217 shuffled into their seats, their conversations blending into a low hum of anticipation. For some, it was a routine trip. For others, the flight marked the beginning of a new chapter. None of them could have predicted the horrifying events about to unfold. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Morris adjusted his headset, his sharp eyes scanning the dashboard. Beside him, First Officer Emma Rios was reviewing the flight plan. "Clear skies ahead," she said, her voice tinged with optimism. "Let's hope it stays that way," Daniel replied, offering a small smile. But deep down, a faint unease gnawed at him, the kind of instinct honed through decades of flying. As the plane taxied to the runway, the air traffic controller's voice crackled through the radio. "Flight 217, cleared for takeoff. Climb to 30,000 feet and maintain heading 270. "Copy that," Daniel responded. The engines roared to life, and the plane surged forward, lifting gracefully into the sky. Below, the city shrank into a patchwork of streets and buildings, the world seeming peaceful from above. For a while, everything was normal. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks. Passengers relaxed, some reading, others watching in-flight movies. In seat 14A, a young journalist named Rachel Carter typed furiously on her laptop, determined to finish her article before landing. Across the aisle, an older man clutched a leather-bound journal, his eyes darting nervously to the window. But as the plane climbed higher, the first sign of trouble appeared. The fastened seatbelt sign blinked on, and a slight turbulence rippled through the cabin. Most passengers paid little attention, assuming it was routine. Daniel's calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." In the cockpit, Emma frowned at the radar. "That's odd. There's no other activity in this region, but the instruments are picking up something." Daniel leaned over to look. The radar displayed a faint blip, flickering in and out like a dying signal. "Could be a glitch," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Keep an eye on it." As the turbulence intensified, Rachel glanced out the window, her journalistic curiosity piqued. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now a dull gray. Dark clouds seemed to materialize out of nowhere, swirling ominously around the plane. "That's not normal," she muttered, grabbing her phone to record. Back in the cockpit, Emma's hands hovered over the controls. "Captain, the blip's getting closer." Daniel's unease deepened. "ATC, this is Flight 217. We're picking up an unidentified object on our radar. Can you confirm?" Static filled the radio, followed by a distorted voice. "Flight 217, no traffic in your vicinity. Maintain current heading." Emma exchanged a worried glance with Daniel. "Something's not right." The turbulence grew worse, shaking the plane violently. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few passengers gasped as their drinks spilled onto their trays. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, steadied herself against the seat, her practiced smile faltering. "Everything's fine, folks. Please remain seated." Then it happened. Out of the swirling clouds emerged another aircraft, its appearance defying explanation. It was an old Boeing 727, its exterior corroded and covered in grime. The windows were dark, but shadows moved inside, figures that didn't seem human. The ghostly plane veered dangerously close to Flight 217, its engines silent, as if propelled by some unnatural force. Rachel's phone captured the moment, her hands trembling. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. In the cockpit, alarms blared. "Collision warning!" Emma shouted, gripping the controls. Daniel reacted instantly, banking the plane sharply to avoid the other aircraft. Passengers screamed as the plane tilted, sending drinks and belongings tumbling to the floor. "Mayday, mayday!" Daniel yelled into the radio. "We have an unidentified aircraft in our path. Requesting immediate assistance." The response was chilling. Static gave way to a low, guttural voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the storm. "You cannot escape." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What the?" The ghostly plane circled them, its decayed fuselage glowing faintly in the dark clouds. The oppressive presence seemed to seep into the cabin, filling the passengers with an inexplicable dread. Lisa clutched her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is this?" Rachel's eyes remained glued to the window. The ghostly plane's cockpit was now visible, and she could see the pilot, or what remained of him. A skeletal figure in a tattered uniform, its hollow eyes glowing faintly, stared back at her. "Captain," Emma said, her voice trembling. "It's matching our every move." Daniel's hands tightened on the yoke. "We're not going down. Not like this." He pushed the throttle forward, forcing the plane into a steep climb. The engines roared in protest, but Flight 217 began to ascend. The ghostly plane followed, its movements unnaturally smooth. In the cabin, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder and more distinct. "Turn back. Join us." Rachel pressed her hands over her ears, her heart racing. "Do you hear that?" she asked the man beside her. He nodded, his face pale. "They're calling to us." Lisa moved through the aisle, her voice shaking as she tried to calm the passengers. "Please stay in your seats. Everything will be all right." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The ghostly whispers in the cabin grew louder, filling the air with an almost tangible presence. Passengers clung to their seats, some murmuring prayers, others staring blankly ahead, paralyzed by fear. Rachel's trembling fingers pressed record on her phone once again, the journalist in her determined to capture every detail despite the terror clawing at her chest. In the cockpit, Daniel and Emma were locked in a battle with the plane. The controls resisted their every command, as though the aircraft itself had turned against them. "Altitude is fluctuating," Emma shouted, her eyes darting between the gauges. "We're dropping again." Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing the yoke forward. "Come on, climb!" But the plane didn't respond. The ghostly Boeing 727 loomed ahead, its decayed structure almost shimmering in the dim light of the storm. It moved with unnatural precision, circling Flight 217 like a predator stalking its prey. "It's not just following us," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's controlling us." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not for long. We're getting out of this." Back in the cabin, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Frost crept across the windows, and the temperature plummeted, visible breaths escaping from passengers' mouths. Lisa stood frozen in the aisle, her practiced composure cracking under the weight of the impossible. A passenger grabbed her arm, his voice trembling. "What's happening? Are we going to crash?" Lisa forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "The pilots are handling it. Please stay calm." But even she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. Rachel turned her camera toward the window, her breath catching as the ghostly plane drew closer. Through its cracked and fogged windows, she could see shadowy figures moving inside. They weren't passengers. They weren't human. One figure turned its hollow gaze toward her, and Rachel's blood ran cold. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers intensified, merging into a single, chilling command. "Turn back. Join us." Lisa stumbled toward Rachel, her face pale. "What are you doing?" "Documenting this," Rachel replied, her voice shaking. "People need to know what's happening." Lisa shook her head. "This isn't something anyone can explain." The plane jolted violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling bags into the aisles. Lisa fell to her knees, gripping the seat for support. The ghostly plane was now directly beside them, its presence sending waves of fear through the cabin. In the cockpit, alarms blared as the instruments flickered erratically. Emma's hands hovered over the controls, her voice trembling. "Captain, we've lost power to Engine 2. Daniel's mind raced. "Divert power from non-essentials. Keep us in the air." Emma nodded, her fingers flying over the switches. The engines roared, struggling against the invisible force holding them down. The ghostly plane matched their every move, its decayed fuselage glowing faintly in the storm. Then, the voice returned. Low, guttural, and all-encompassing. You cannot escape. Daniel's grip tightened on the yoke. We'll see about that. With a sudden burst of determination, he pushed the plane into a sharp climb. The passengers screamed as the aircraft tilted steeply, their belongings sliding down the aisles. Rachel clutched her phone, her knuckles white as she recorded the chaos. The ghostly plane followed, its movements unnaturally smooth. Frost coated the controls in the cockpit, and Emma's fingers trembled as she wiped it away. It's like it's toying with us, she said, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't respond. His focus was on the horizon, where a faint light flickered in the distance. Do you see that? He asked. Emma squinted. It's something. It's our way out, Daniel said firmly. I'm sure of it. In the cabin, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the temperature dropped further. Passengers huddled together, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Lisa moved through the aisle, her voice hoarse as she tried to calm them. We're going to be okay, she said, though her own fear was evident. Rachel turned her camera toward the faint light on the horizon, hope flickering in her chest. But as the ghostly plane loomed closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that their nightmare was far from over. The light ahead grew brighter, its pulsating glow casting an eerie illumination across the cabin. Passengers clung to their seats as the turbulence intensified, shaking the plane violently. Frost continued to spread across the windows, and the oppressive whispers filled the air like a haunting melody. In the cockpit, Daniel and Emma were running out of options. The controls refused to respond, and the ghostly Boeing 727 mirrored their every move. The radar pinged erratically, showing the spectral plane circling them like a predator stalking its prey. We're losing power to the engines, Emma said, her voice trembling. We can't climb any higher. Daniel's jaw tightened. We need to keep moving toward that light. It's the only chance we have. Emma nodded, her hands flying over the controls as she diverted power to the remaining engine. The hum of the aircraft's systems grew louder, accompanied by the guttural roar of the ghostly plane outside. It was so close now that Daniel could see the skeletal figures in the cockpit, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They're waiting for us to fail, he muttered. But we're not going to give them the satisfaction. In the cabin, Rachel continued filming, her phone capturing the chaos around her. Passengers cried out as the plane jolted again, the lights flickering ominously. Lisa stumbled down the aisle, trying to calm the terrified passengers, but her own fear was evident in her trembling hands. Stay seated. Keep your seatbelts fastened, she shouted, though her voice was barely audible over the growing roar of the engines and the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rachel turned her camera toward the window, focusing on the ghostly plane as it drifted closer. Its decayed fuselage seemed to shimmer in the unnatural light, and the shadows inside it moved with a menacing grace. This can't be real, she whispered. It's like it's alive. Beside her, the older man with the leather journal clutched the armrest, his knuckles white. They're trying to pull us in, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They want us to join them. Rachel turned to him, her heart pounding. What do you mean? Do you know what this is? The man's eyes were wide with fear. This isn't the first time. Planes disappear all the time, don't they? Maybe this is where they go. Before Rachel could respond, the plane jolted violently, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. Passengers screamed as the oppressive whispers grew louder, drowning out all other sound. The ghostly plane was now directly alongside them, its presence an inescapable weight pressing down on everyone. In the cockpit, Daniel and Emma struggled to maintain control as the instruments failed completely. The only light came from the pulsating glow ahead, casting long shadows across their faces. What if it's a trap? Emma asked, her voice shaking. What if that light is in our way out? Daniel hesitated, his instincts warring with his desperation. It's the only thing we've got. If we stay here, we're done for. He pushed the throttle forward, forcing the plane toward the light. The engines roared in protest, and the ghostly plane followed, its movements impossibly smooth. The guttural voice returned, filling the cockpit with a chilling command. Turn back, or join us. Daniel ignored it, his focus unwavering. Not today! In the cabin, the temperature plummeted further, and the frost on the windows thickened. Rachel's breath fogged the air as she turned her camera toward the passengers. Fear was etched on every face, their eyes darting nervously toward the windows and the shadows that seemed to move within the cabin itself. Lisa approached Rachel, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Documenting this," Rachel replied. "If we make it out of this, people need to know." Lisa shook her head. "And if we don't?" Rachel didn't answer. She turned back to the window, focusing on the ghostly plane. It was so close now that she could see cracks in its fuselage, the decayed metal barely holding together. The skeletal figures inside turned their heads in unison, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they stared directly at her. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the cabin lights flickered back on, illuminating the terror-stricken faces of the passengers. The older man beside Rachel clutched his journal tightly, his lips moving in silent prayer. "We're almost there," Daniel said over the intercom, his voice filled with determination. "Hold on, everyone." The pulsating light grew brighter, enveloping the plane in a blinding glow. The ghostly aircraft surged forward, its decayed wings stretching toward Flight 217 as if to pull it into the void. Passengers screamed, their fear echoing through the cabin as the light consumed everything. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light vanished, leaving the plane in darkness once more. The oppressive silence in the cabin was broken by the rhythmic hum of the engines as they fought to stay aloft. The light ahead, once pulsating with promise, now seemed both a beacon of hope and a potential trap. Passengers held their breath, their terror hanging thick in the frigid air. "We're almost there." Daniel's voice crackled over the intercom. His tone was steady but strained, every word carrying the weight of the impossible battle they were fighting. "Hold on." In the cockpit, Emma's hands trembled as she worked the controls. The instruments continued to flicker, barely responsive, but the light ahead seemed to grow closer with each passing second. "The ghost plane, it's closing in again," she said, her voice shaking. Daniel glanced at the radar, though it offered little help. The ghostly Boeing 727 hovered just off their wing, its decayed fuselage glowing faintly in the stormy darkness. "We're not letting it take us. Focus on the climb," he said firmly. The guttural voice returned, filling the cockpit and cabin alike. "You cannot escape. The void claims all." In the cabin, Rachel gripped her phone, her knuckles white as she recorded the chaos. The whispers that had haunted them since the beginning were now a deafening roar, drowning out the cries of the passengers. Frost spread across the windows, and the temperature plummeted further, each breath forming visible clouds in the air. Lisa stumbled down the aisle, clutching the backs of seats for support. She stopped near Rachel, her face pale and etched with fear. "Is it still there?" Rachel nodded, pointing toward the window. "It's closer than ever." Lisa hesitated, then whispered, "What happens if we don't make it to that light?" Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't. The thought was too terrifying to voice. Suddenly, the plane jolted violently, and passengers screamed as the ghostly 727 surged forward, its decayed wings stretching as though to envelop Flight 217. Daniel pulled the yoke hard to the left, forcing the plane into a steep bank. The engines roared in protest, but the aircraft responded, narrowly avoiding the spectral plane. "We're not going down," Daniel growled through gritted teeth. "Not like this." The light ahead grew impossibly bright, illuminating the cabin in an ethereal glow. The whispers transformed into a single, deafening voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Join us!" Emma cried out, her hands flying to her ears. "Captain, it's overwhelming!" "Focus!" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're breaking through. Hold on." In the cabin, the light engulfed everything, casting passengers in stark relief against the darkness. Rachel's phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor as she shielded her eyes. Lisa dropped to her knees, clutching a nearby seat for support. And then it happened. The ghostly plane collided with their own, But instead of an explosion, there was silence. Time seemed to stand still as the two planes merged, their forms overlapping in a surreal display of light and shadow. Passengers stared in horror as the skeletal figures from the ghostly plane appeared in the aisles, their hollow eyes fixed on the living. Rachel's heart raced as one of the figures turned toward her, its hand reaching out. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be it." Lisa screamed, grabbing Rachel's arm. "Don't look at them! Don't let them pull you in!" In the cockpit, Daniel and Emma fought against the controls, their determination unwavering. "Full throttle," Daniel ordered, his voice a mixture of desperation and resolve. "We're breaking through that light." The engines roared louder than ever before, and the plane surged forward, tearing away from the spectral 727. The ghostly figures in the cabin began to fade, their hollow eyes losing their glow as the light consumed them. The oppressive whispers dissolved into silence. The plane burst through the light, emerging into a clear, star-filled sky. The turbulence ceased, and the cabin was filled with stunned silence. Passengers looked around, their faces pale but filled with a glimmer of hope. In the cockpit, Daniel slumped back in his seat, his hands still gripping the controls. "We're clear," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma exhaled shakily, her eyes scanning the now stable instruments. "Altitude holding steady. Engines are responding. We made it." In the cabin, Rachel picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she stopped the recording. She turned to Lisa, who was sitting on the floor, her face buried in her hands. "Is it over?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible. Lisa looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "I don't know." The passengers began to stir, their murmurs growing louder as relief replaced their fear. Daniel's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've cleared the turbulence and are back on course. Please remain seated as we prepare for our descent." A soft cheer rippled through the cabin, though it was tinged with exhaustion. Rachel glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The light was gone, and the night sky stretched endlessly before them. But as she stared into the void, a faint glimmer caught her eye. It was distant, barely visible, but unmistakable. The ghostly 727 was still out there, waiting, watching, and ready to claim its next victims.